Have you ever loved someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't just break your heart? It shattered your entire reality. What if the man you swore to honor in front of God and the entire aristocracy was laughing at your devotion behind closed doors? This is the documented account of Lady Beatrice Harrington, a woman who possessed the world at her feet, only to discover her life was built upon a foundation of cruel, calculated lies. When she overheard the Duke and his mistress tearing her apart in the shadows, she didn't scream, she didn't cry, she packed nothing and vanished into the fog before dawn. Listen closely, because the truth behind the gilded gates of the aristocracy is far darker and more twisted than you could ever imagine. The year was 1884, and the Stirling estate, known throughout Oxfordshire as the jewel of the Rothbury Duchy, was ablaze with light. It was the night of the autumn equinox gala, an event so exclusive that invitations were bartered for in the shadowed corners of Parliament and the drawing rooms of Mayfair. Carriages lined the sweeping gravel driveway, their lacquered doors bearing the crests of England's most formidable families, the Earls of Clarendon, the Viscounts of Pembroke, even whispers of minor royalty mingling in the grand ballroom. At the centre of it all stood Lady Beatrice. She was 21, the only daughter of the late Lord Henry Harrington, a man whose vast fortunes in the shipping trade had made him indispensable to the crown. When Beatrice's father passed away, he left her an inheritance so staggering it shifted the economic balance of the peerage. But with that wealth came a target on her back. Enter Alistair Stirling, the Duke of Rothbury. Alistair was 10 years her senior, a man carved from marble and ambition, with striking aristocratic features, piercing blue eyes, and a lineage that traced back to the Plantagenets. He was the catch of the season. To the world, their union was a fairy tale. The wealthy, innocent heiress and the powerful, established duke. Their wedding at St. George's, Hanover Square, had been the subject of society papers for months. Standing beneath the glittering cascade of a three-tiered crystal chandelier, Beatrice forced a practiced, serene smile as she greeted the procession of guests. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every breath she took. Around her neck rested the sterling sapphires, heavy, cold stones that felt more like a collar than an adornment. "You look radiant tonight, Your Grace," murmured Lady Margaret, an elderly dowager who scrutinized Beatrice through a pair of gold-rimmed lorgnettes. "The Duke is a fortunate man." "Thank you, Lady Margaret," Beatrice replied softly, her voice carrying the gentle, refined cadence she had been taught since childhood. "Alistair is exceptionally kind." She scanned the crowded room for her husband. She spotted him near the towering marble fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, holding court among a group of influential politicians. He threw his head back in a laugh, a sound that usually made Beatrice's heart flutter. She loved him. She had loved him since the moment he first kissed her hand in her aunt's drawing room, whispering that she was the breath of fresh air his complicated life desperately needed. But lately, an invisible wall of frost had settled between them. Alistair was frequently absent, citing business in London or endless meetings with his estate managers. When he was home, his touches were perfunctory, his gaze distant. Beatrice had convinced herself it was the pressure of the dukedom. She had spent the last 3 months poring over estate ledgers, trying to understand his burdens, trying to be the perfect duchess. As she watched him, the crowd parted slightly, and a woman glided to his side. It was Lady Genevieve Croft. Genevieve was the young widow of a minor baron. She was striking in a way that commanded attention. Raven hair, emerald eyes, and a sharp, devastating wit that could cut a man down to size or build him into a king, depending on her mood. She was draped in crimson silk, a stark, bold contrast to Beatrice's demure blue. Beatrice felt a fleeting, irrational pang of insecurity as Genevieve leaned in close to Alistair, whispering something that made the Duke's eyes dark and his smile turn conspiratorial. Beatrice brushed the feeling aside, berating herself. Genevieve was an old family friend, a fixture in Alistair's circle long before Beatrice had arrived. To harbor jealousy was beneath her station. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the swelling notes of Strauss filling the cavernous room, the heat of the ballroom, the heavy scent of roasted pheasant, imported orchids, and overpowering musky perfumes suddenly became suffocating. The air grew thin in Beatrice's lungs. The weight of the sapphires pressed against her collarbone, a physical reminder of the role she was failing to play perfectly. "Pardon me," Beatrice murmured to the surrounding guests, politely declining a dance from a young cavalry officer. "I just need a moment of air." She slipped through the heavy, gilded doors leading out of the ballroom, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the West Wing. She didn't know it yet, but those few steps away from the light were taking her directly into the darkest, most agonizing revelation of her life. The West Wing was silent, the thick Persian carpets absorbing the frantic clicking of Beatrice's heels. She moved like a ghost through the dim corridors, craving the damp, earthy peace of the grand conservatory. It was her favorite place in the estate, a massive, glass-domed structure her father's money had helped restore, filled with exotic ferns, towering palms and night-blooming jasmine. As she approached the wrought-iron doors of the conservatory, she noticed they were slightly ajar. The faint glow of a single gas lamp illuminated the dense foliage within. Beatrice placed her gloved hand on the cold iron, preparing to push it open, when a sound froze the blood in her veins. It was a laugh, low, rich, and distinctly masculine, Alistair's laugh. But it wasn't the boisterous public laugh he had used in the ballroom. It was intimate, secretive. "You play with fire, Alistair," a woman's voice purred. Genevieve. Her tone was dripping with dark amusement. "Leaving your little bride to entertain the vultures while you hide in the bushes with me." Beatrice stood paralyzed. Her hand remained glued to the iron door, her breathing completely suspended. The rational part of her mind screamed at her to walk away, to turn back and preserve her dignity, but her body refused to obey. She peered through the narrow gap between the doors. Through the sprawling fronds of a massive fern, she could see them. Alistair was leaning against a stone fountain, his coat discarded, his cravat loosened. Genevieve stood between his legs, her hands resting brazenly on his chest, her fingers toying with the gold buttons of his waistcoat. "She isn't entertaining them," Alistair scoffed, his voice devoid of the warmth he usually feigned in public. "She's likely standing in a corner, terrified someone might ask her a question about foreign policy. The girl is as dull as dishwater, Genevieve. I swear, trying to converse with her is like speaking to a particularly well-dressed portrait." The words struck Beatrice with the force of a physical blow. A sharp, localized pain flared in her chest, so intense she almost gasped aloud. She pressed her free hand over her mouth, biting down on her leather glove to keep silent. Genevieve traced a delicate finger along Alistair's jawline. "Oh, be fair, darling. She serves her purpose. I saw the newly restored East Wing. The Harrington shipping fortune has done wonders for the rotting foundations of your beloved ancestral home." Alistair let out a bitter, cynical sigh, wrapping his arms around Genevieve's waist and pulling her flush against him. "Her money saved this estate from ruin, yes, and for that I tolerate her pathetic, wide-eyed adoration. Do you know she actually spent 3 hours yesterday trying to embroider my initials onto a handkerchief? It's nauseating. She's a child playing dress-up in a duchess's gown." "And what of her heart, my ruthless duke?" Genevieve mocked, though her eyes glinted with triumph. "Do you not fear breaking the fragile little thing?" Alistair scoffed, the sound echoing cruelly off the glass ceiling. "She doesn't have the constitution for heartbreak. She's too weak, too desperate for my approval. If she ever found out about us, she'd likely just cry into her tea and beg me to love her. She's a convenience, Genevieve, a very wealthy, very gullible convenience. You are the only woman who truly rules me." With that, he crushed his mouth against Genevieve's. It was a kiss of raw, desperate passion, a passion he had never, not even on their wedding night, shown to Beatrice. In the shadows, Beatrice didn't collapse. She didn't burst through the doors in a tearful rage, demanding explanations. The immense, crushing weight of the betrayal did something entirely unexpected. It didn't break her into pieces. It froze her solid. The illusion she had lived in for the past 2 years burned away in an instant, leaving behind a terrifying, blinding clarity. Every late night, every cold touch, every dismissive comment masquerading as a joke, it all aligned with horrifying precision. He didn't love her. He had never loved her. She was a bank vault to him, a naive, stupid girl whose affection he weaponized to fund his extravagant lifestyle and his long-standing affair. She watched them for another agonizing second, searing the image of their intertwined bodies into her brain. She needed to remember this exact moment. She needed to remember the cruel twist of his mouth, the mocking tone of his voice, the utter lack of respect he held for the woman who had handed him her life and her fortune. Slowly, carefully, Beatrice withdrew her hand from the door. She took one step back into the dark corridor, then another. She turned and began to walk. Her heart, which had been racing wildly just moments before, now beat with a slow, heavy, mechanical rhythm. The girl who had walked toward the conservatory, desperate for her husband's love, was dead. The woman who walked back into the shadows of the mansion was entirely someone else. Beatrice didn't return to the ballroom. She bypassed the grand staircase, taking the hidden servants' corridors up to the master suite. The muffled sounds of the orchestra and the clinking of champagne glasses faded into nothingness, replaced by the deafening silence of her own absolute resolve. When she entered her opulent dressing room, she locked the heavy oak door behind her. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror and looked at herself, the Duchess of Rothbury, the midnight blue velvet, the intricate braids in her hair, the heavy makeup that made her look older, more sophisticated. It was a costume, a ridiculous, expensive costume for a play that had just been violently cancelled. With trembling, clumsy fingers, she reached back and struggled with the intricate hooks of her gown. When a stubborn clasp refused to yield, a sudden, blinding spike of rage gave her strength. She gripped the velvet fabric and pulled with all her might, hearing the satisfying, violent sound of expensive silk and thread ripping apart. The gown fell to the floor in a heavy pool. Next came the jewels. She unclasped the sterling sapphires, the pride of the Duke's family, and let them drop carelessly onto her vanity table. They hit the polished mahogany with a heavy, hollow thud. She removed the diamond earrings, the pearl bracelets, tossing them onto the growing pile of discarded wealth. Finally, she looked down at her left hand, the wedding band, a flawless 3-carat diamond set in platinum. She twisted it off her finger. It felt hot, almost burning her skin. She placed it dead center on the vanity, right next to a silver-framed portrait of her and Alistair on their wedding day. She didn't smash the picture. Leaving it perfectly intact felt like a colder, sharper knife. "I will not be a convenience," she thought, the words echoing in her mind with terrifying clarity. "And I will not leave with a single thing his name bought." She moved to the back of her immense wardrobe, pushing past rows of Parisian silks, furs, and imported lace. In the darkest corner hung a plain, grey woolen dress and a heavy, unadorned black travelling cloak. They were garments she had purchased months ago for a charitable visit to a London orphanage, meant to keep her inconspicuous. Tonight, they would be her armour. She dressed quickly, abandoning the suffocating corset, pulling the rough wool over her head. She took a simple leather satchel. What should she take? Her mind raced. The Harrington accounts were entirely under Alistair's legal control now. By law, as her husband, he owned everything. Her estates, her money, even her physical person. If she took her own jewelry to sell, he could have her arrested for theft. The law did not protect naive wives from cruel husbands. She opened a secret compartment in her writing desk. Inside was a velvet pouch containing 30 gold sovereigns, money she had hoarded from her personal pin allowance, quietly saved over the last year. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to maintain a duchess, but it was enough to disappear. She dropped the pouch into the satchel, along with a single silver comb that had belonged to her mother, and a thick woolen shawl. Nothing else. She would take nothing else. To take his things was to remain bound to him. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4 times. 4 a.m. The gala below had finally dwindled to an end. The last of the carriages were departing, and a heavy, thick pre-dawn fog was rolling over the vast manicured lawns of the estate. Beatrice pulled the hood of the black cloak over her head, completely obscuring her face. She unlocked her bedroom door and slipped out. Navigating the sleeping house required absolute precision. She knew the floorboards that creaked, the doors that whined on their hinges. She descended the rear servant stairs, holding her breath as she passed the quarters of the housekeeper. The smell of cold ash and stale wine hung heavy in the air of the kitchen as she moved through the scullery toward the tradesman's exit. When she finally pushed open the heavy wooden door, the cold bite of the October morning hit her face like a physical shock. The fog was incredibly dense, a swirling sea of white that swallowed the grand estate whole. Beatrice stepped out onto the damp cobblestones. She didn't look back. There was no tearful goodbye to the sprawling manor, no final, longing gaze at the window of the room she had shared with a monster. She simply walked. Her thin leather boots crunched softly against the gravel path leading toward the outer boundary wall. The world was utterly silent, save for the haunting call of an owl in the distant woods. With every step she took away from Stirling Manor, the heavy, suffocating weight in her chest began to lift. It was replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating emptiness. She was Lady Beatrice Harrington, a woman without a home, without a title, and soon without an identity. The Duke of Rothbury would wake up in a few hours to find his obedient little wife gone, his perfectly orchestrated life shattered. He would hunt her. He would use his power, his money, and his influence to drag her back to the gilded cage. But as Beatrice reached the iron gates of the estate and slipped through the pedestrian turnstile into the thick, blinding fog of the countryside, a cold, hard smile touched her lips for the first time that night. Let him hunt. A ghost leaves no footprints. The morning sun broke over the sprawling grounds of Stirling Manor, casting long, sharp shadows across the dew-soaked lawns. Inside the grand house, the aftermath of the autumn equinox gala was being swept away by a small army of servants. In the master suite, Alistair Stirling, the Duke of Rothbury, woke with a dull pounding in his temples and the lingering taste of expensive brandy and Genevieve's perfume on his skin. He rose lazily, ringing for his valet to draw a bath. It was nearing 10 o'clock. By custom, he and Beatrice took a late breakfast together in the morning room after such events, a tedious, silent affair where she would dutifully pour his tea and he would ignore her while reading the Times. Dressed in a silk dressing gown, Alistair walked down the corridor and knocked twice on Beatrice's door. There was no answer. Annoyed by the slight breach in routine, he turned the heavy brass handle. The door was unlocked. "Beatrice, it is nearly—" Alistair's voice died in his throat. The opulent dressing room was freezing. The window had been left ajar, letting the damp autumn air seep into the silk-lined walls. But it wasn't the cold that froze the Duke. It was the absolute, eerie stillness of the room. His eyes fell immediately to the floor. There, pooled like discarded rubbish, was the midnight blue velvet gown she had worn the night before. The bodice was violently torn, the intricate silver threading ripped and unspooled. It was an act of brutal desecration that made no sense to him. Beatrice was meticulous, gentle. She treated her garments with reverence. A cold sweat prickled at the back of Alistair's neck. He stepped further into the room, his gaze moving to the mahogany vanity. The sterling sapphires were heaped in a careless pile. Beside them lay the diamond earrings and the heavy pearl bracelets, and there, positioned with agonizing precision in the exact center of the table, directly in front of their silver-framed wedding portrait, was her wedding band. Alistair stared at the ring, his breath hitching. For a moment, his arrogant mind refused to process the visual evidence. "She is punishing me," he thought, a spark of irritation masking his growing panic. "She is throwing a childish tantrum. She must have found out about Genevieve." He tore through the suite, pulling open the massive cedar wardrobes. Her expensive silks, her furs, her imported Parisian day dresses all remained perfectly hung. Her riding boots, her customized hats, her parasols were untouched. "Thomas!" Alistair roared, his voice echoing violently down the corridor. Within seconds, his head valet appeared, eyes wide with alarm. "Your Grace, where is my wife?" Alistair demanded, grabbing the terrified servant by the lapels of his uniform. "Where is the Duchess?" I do not know, Your Grace. Her maid Lucy went in to wake her an hour ago, but found the bed unslept in. We assumed she had risen early to walk the gardens, search the grounds, search the conservatories, the stables, the maze. Now, For 3 hours, the estate was turned upside down. Stable boys scoured the woods. Gardeners waded through the ornamental lakes. Nothing. It was as if Lady Beatrice Harrington had evaporated into the morning fog. By mid-afternoon, the reality of the situation crashed down upon Alistair in his private study. He poured himself a harsh measure of whiskey, his hands trembling. She hadn't been kidnapped. Kidnappers would have taken the sapphires. She had left, willingly. The panic that gripped Alistair was not born of lost love. It was a cold, terrifying financial terror. While the Duke had legal control over Beatrice's wealth by marriage, the Harrington Trust, the massive core of her father's shipping empire, had a failsafe. Lord Henry Harrington had been a shrewd, paranoid businessman. He had stipulated that while the Duke could freely spend the interest and manage the properties, any liquidation of the principal capital required the physical, witness signature of his daughter. Alistair was heavily in debt. The gala, the renovations to the estate, the lavish gifts he showered upon Genevieve, the gambling debts in Mayfair. He had spent vastly beyond the interest. He was relying on forcing Beatrice to sign over a significant portion of the principal the following week to appease his creditors. Without her, the Duke of Rothbury was functionally bankrupt. Alistair moved to his desk and penned a rapid, desperate letter. He did not summon the local constabulary. The police would ask questions, file reports, and alert the society papers. The scandal of a runaway duchess would ruin his political ambitions, but the revelation of his impending insolvency would destroy his life. Instead, he summoned Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was not a man spoken of in polite society. He was a fixer for the aristocracy, a former Scotland Yard inspector who had realized there was far more money to be made burying the sins of the elite than exposing them. He arrived at Stirling Manor just after dusk, a tall, gaunt man with eyes like chipped flint and a demeanor completely devoid of deference. Alistair led him to Beatrice's dressing room, explaining the cover story. The Duchess has suffered a nervous collapse. She has wandered off in a state of delirium. I need her found and returned immediately. With absolute discretion, Pendleton listened in silence, his sharp eyes scanning the torn dress and the discarded jewels. He picked up the wedding band, examining it in the lamplight. "Delirium, Your Grace." Pendleton's voice was like grinding stones. "A delirious woman wanders out in her nightgown. She does not systematically remove every item purchased with your money. She does not leave her wedding ring perfectly centered before a photograph of you. This is not madness, Duke. This is a declaration." Alistair's jaw tightened. "Just find her, Pendleton. Name your price. I don't care what it takes." Pendleton dropped the ring back onto the vanity. "I will track her, but you must understand the difficulty. If she had taken the jewels, she would be easy to find. Thieves and pawnbrokers leave paper trails, but by taking nothing of value, she has stripped herself of her identity. You are not looking for the Duchess of Rothbury, Your Grace. You are looking for a ghost, and ghosts are notoriously difficult to catch." Miles away, the ghost was currently shivering in a third-class railway carriage bound for London's King's Cross. Beatrice had walked for 5 miles in the freezing fog before reaching a small, rural station in the next county. She had paid for her ticket with a single gold sovereign, keeping her face hidden beneath the deep hood of her black cloak. The ticketmaster, half asleep, had barely glanced at her. As the train rattled toward the capital, Beatrice underwent a physical and psychological transformation. She took the silver comb her mother had given her and aggressively scraped back her intricate, aristocratic curls, tying her hair into a severe, harsh knot at the nape of her neck. She rubbed soot from the carriage windowsill onto her hands and under her fingernails. She practiced dulling the refined, musical cadence of her voice, dropping her consonants, adopting the flatter, harder vowels of the working class. When the train finally hissed to a halt at King's Cross, the sheer volume of London hit her like a tidal wave. This was not the London she knew. There were no polished carriages waiting to whisk her to Mayfair townhouses. This was a chaotic, suffocating sea of humanity. Hawkers screaming their wares, the heavy metallic stench of industry, the choking smog of coal fires, and the desperate, hurried faces of the poor. Beatrice didn't head west toward the wealthy districts. She walked east, plunging deliberately into the labyrinthine slums of Spitalfields. The streets here were narrow and choked with filth. Drunken sailors, destitute families, and sharp-eyed pickpockets crowded the alleyways. Every instinct bred into Beatrice screamed at her to flee, to find a parlor, to find safety, but she clamped down on her fear with an iron will. Fear was a luxury for the rich. By nightfall, she found a boarding house run by a formidable, barrel-chested woman named Mrs. Gable. The sign in the window advertised a room for 2 shillings a week. Mrs. Gable looked Beatrice up and down, her eyes lingering on the high-quality, though plain, wool of her dress. "What's your business, girl? I run a decent house. No women of the night, no thieves." "My name is Clara Hayes," Beatrice said, forcing her voice to remain steady and flat. "I am a widow from the north. My husband left me nothing but debts, so I've come to London to find respectable work. I can pay a month in advance." The sight of the gold sovereigns softened Mrs. Gable's scowl. She snatched the coins and handed Beatrice a rusted iron key. "Top floor, end of the hall. The privy is in the yard. Don't waste the lamp oil." The room was no larger than Beatrice's former wardrobe. It contained a narrow cot with a lumpy mattress, a wash basin, and a single draughty window looking out over a sea of blackened chimney pots. It was freezing. It smelled of boiled cabbage and damp rot, and it was the most beautiful room Beatrice had ever seen, because it was hers, and Alistair could not enter it. She sat on the edge of the cot, and, for the first time since she overheard the conversation in the conservatory, Beatrice allowed herself to cry. She wept for the girl she had been, for the love she had foolishly given, and for the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what she had done. But she only allowed herself 10 minutes. When the tears stopped, she washed her face in the freezing basin. Survival required action. The next few weeks were a brutal education. Beatrice quickly realized that her 30 sovereigns, while a fortune to some in Spitalfields, would not last indefinitely if she did not find an income. She spent her days walking the mercantile districts near the docks, seeking work as a seamstress, a governess, a shop girl. But she lacked references, and her hands, despite her efforts to dirty them, were too soft. Employers looked at her with suspicion. Desperation began to gnaw at her. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, she wandered into a chaotic, loud warehouse near the customs house. The sign outside read, "Nathaniel Reed and Company, importers of fine goods." Inside, men were shouting, hoisting crates of tea and spices. In the center of the chaos, inside a small glass-partitioned office, sat a large, red-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers. He was violently throwing ledgers onto the floor, swearing loudly at a terrified young clerk. "It doesn't balance," the man roared. £300 sterling is missing from the India manifests. You incompetent fool! Find it, or you're out on the street." The clerk fled the office in tears. Beatrice stood by the door watching. During her desperate attempts to connect with Alistair, she had spent months forcing herself to understand the Harrington shipping ledgers. She understood tariffs, weight conversions, and complex maritime accounting. She walked past the shouting dockworkers, pushed open the glass door, and stepped into the office. Nathaniel Reed glared at her. "Who the devil are you? We don't give to charity here, woman." "I am not here for charity," Beatrice said firmly. "I am here for a job. My name is Clara Hayes, and I can find your missing £300. Reed let out a bark of cynical laughter. "You, a woman off the street, is going to decipher the East India manifests? "Give me 10 minutes, Beatrice challenged, stepping up to the desk and pulling the heavy leather-bound ledger toward her. "If I don't find the discrepancy, I will leave and never return. If I do, you hire me as your bookkeeper." Reed narrowed his eyes, intrigued by her sheer audacity. 10 minutes, go." Beatrice sat down. The numbers swam before her eyes for a moment, but then her mind snapped into focus. She traced her finger down the columns, her brain calculating the conversions from rupees to sterling, cross-referencing the weight of the tea against the listed freight charges. Her eyes darted to the secondary tariff column. 8 minutes later, she tapped the page with a pen. "Here," she said, "your clerk didn't lose £300. He failed to carry the decimal point on the newly imposed port tax in Bombay. He applied a 10% tariff instead of a 1% tariff across 12 shipments. The money isn't missing. It was never supposed to be deducted from your net profit. Your accounts are perfectly solvent, Mr. Reed. Your clerk just lacks basic arithmetic skills." Nathaniel Reed stared at the ledger, verifying her math. His jaw slowly dropped. He looked up at Beatrice, seeing not a poor widow from the north, but a woman with a mind as sharp as a steel trap. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "4 shillings a week, Mrs. Hayes. You start tomorrow." 6 months passed. In the wealthy enclaves of Mayfair, the disappearance of the Duchess of Rothbury had transitioned from a frantic secret to a heavily guarded society rumor. A prolonged retreat to a Swiss sanatorium for her nerves was the official line fed to the press. But behind closed doors, Alistair Sterling was a man unraveling. Without Beatrice's signature, the Harrington principal remained locked behind impenetrable iron gates at the Bank of England. His creditors had grown weary of his excuses. His tailor refused to extend his credit. His gambling club had quietly suspended his membership. Even worse, Genevieve Croft had begun to show her true colors. As Alistair's lavish gifts ceased and his temper worsened, Genevieve's affection cooled dramatically. She began accepting carriage rides from a wealthy, elderly Prussian diplomat, leaving Alistair to stew in his crumbling, heavily mortgaged ancestral home. Arthur Pendleton, however, had not stopped hunting. The detective was methodical. He knew Beatrice had left with only the clothes on her back and whatever cash she had hoarded. He had spent months interviewing railway ticket masters, carriage drivers, and pawn shop owners within a 50-mile radius of Stirling Manor. His breakthrough came in the form of a disgruntled maid at a country inn who remembered a woman in a heavy black cloak paying for a cup of tea with a pristine gold sovereign on the morning of the autumn equinox. Pendleton traced the train line from that specific station. It led directly into the heart of London. King's Cross. He narrowed his search. A woman of Beatrice's upbringing, no matter how clever, could not survive on the streets. She had to be indoors. She had to be working. But doing what? She couldn't sew well enough for a factory. She lacked the calluses for domestic scrubbing, and she was too refined for tavern work. Pendleton began canvassing the employment agencies and mercantile hubs, looking for a woman who was overqualified, spoke too well when she forgot herself, and had appeared out of nowhere 6 months prior. Meanwhile, deep in the bustling chaos of the Customs House district, Clara Hayes was thriving. Beatrice was no longer the fragile, terrified girl who had fled into the fog. The physical labor of walking the city, the inadequate diet, and the harsh cold of her boarding house had stripped away her aristocratic softness. She was leaner, her face sharper, her eyes holding a hardened, calculating glint. She had become indispensable to Nathaniel Reed. Within 3 months, she had completely reorganized his chaotic filing system, identified 2 dock foremen who were skimming profits, and negotiated a better tariff rate with the French customs agents by writing to them in flawless Parisian French, a skill she claimed to have learned from a strict schoolmistress. Reed paid her 10 shillings a week now. She had moved out of the freezing attic at Mrs. Gable's and into a small, clean 2-room flat above a bakery on Fleet Street. She bought her own coal. She bought her own books. She was independent, beholden to no man, and for the first time in her life she felt a profound, burning sense of pride. But her 2 worlds were on a collision course. Nathaniel Reed's business was expanding. He was securing contracts to transport exotic goods, spices from Ceylon, silks from Canton. To do this, he needed larger vessels. He began subcontracting cargo space on ships owned by the massive, monopolistic maritime fleets. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Reed walked into Beatrice's small office, dropping a thick stack of vellum contracts onto her desk. "Good news, Clara," he boomed, lighting a foul-smelling cigar. "We've secured space on 3 clippers bound for the West Indies. The rates are steep, but the profit margins on the sugar return will double our quota. Review these contracts, check the liability clauses, and file them." "Of course, Mr. Reed," Beatrice said, adjusting her spectacles, a cheap pair of wire-rimmed glasses she had bought to further disguise her face. She opened the first contract. The legal jargon was dense, but she navigated it easily. She turned to the final page to check the signatory seals. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to suddenly stop. There, stamped in deep red wax, was a crest she knew intimately, a shield divided by a chevron, flanked by 2 rampant lions, the crest of the Duke of Rothbury. Beneath the seal, written in the sharp, arrogant, sprawling handwriting she had once spent hours trying to emulate on handkerchiefs was the signature, Alistair Sterling, for the Harrington Shipping Trust. Beatrice's hands began to shake. She quickly flipped through the other contracts. They were all the same. Nathaniel Reed had just unknowingly entered into a massive financial partnership with the very empire she had fled, her husband's empire. She stared at the signature, feeling a cold dread pool in her stomach. Alistair was liquidating the fleet's cargo space. He was renting out her father's ships to independent merchants like Reed to generate fast, liquid cash. It was a desperate move, the financial equivalent of pawning the family silver. It meant Alistair was drowning in debt. "Is there a problem with the clauses, Clara?" Reed called out from the main floor, noticing her sudden stillness through the glass partition. "No, Mr. Reed," Beatrice forced herself to call back, her voice tight. Everything is in order, but everything was far from in order. If Reed was doing business with the Harrington Trust, it meant his ledgers, the very ledgers Beatrice maintained, written entirely in her distinct handwriting, would eventually be audited and cross-referenced by the Trust's legal clerks in Mayfair. Her handwriting was elegant, educated, and completely out of place for a working-class widow from the north. If a clerk recognized it, or worse, if Alistair saw a copy of the manifests she had signed, her cover would be blown. She had to leave. She had to pack her small bag, abandon her flat, and disappear again. But as she sat there, staring at Alistair's signature, the fear slowly morphed into something else. The girl who had run into the fog would have fled, but the woman who had spent 6 months fighting for her survival in the gutters of London felt a sudden, terrifying surge of defiance. Alistair was desperate. He was bleeding money. He needed her signature to access the principal, and without it, he was tearing the company apart to survive. Beatrice looked at the ledger on her desk. She held the power. She knew exactly how the Harrington Trust was structured. She knew its vulnerabilities, its hidden accounts, its leverage points. She was no longer a helpless wife trapped in a gilded cage. She was a ghost with access to the financial nervous system of her enemy. A slow, dangerous smile crept across Beatrice's face. She didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to finish what he started. Just 2 miles away, in a dimly lit tavern in Covent Garden, Arthur Pendleton was sliding a gold coin across a sticky wooden table to a ragged-looking man. "You're sure?" Pendleton rasped. The informant pocketed the coin, nodding vigorously. "Aye, sir. I drinks with the dockers at Customs House. They all talk about old man Reed's new bookkeeper. A woman, proper stuck up, speaks like a bleeding queen when she's angry, and does math faster than a banker. Name of Clara Hayes." Pendleton stood up, adjusting his coat. A cold, predatory satisfaction settled over him. "Clara Hayes," Pendleton murmured to himself, stepping out into the London rain. "Let us see if you are a ghost or just a duchess playing a very dangerous game." The cobblestones of Fleet Street were slick with freezing rain when Beatrice finally locked the door to Nathaniel Reed's warehouse. The gas lamps hissed in the damp London evening, casting long, distorted halos of yellow light through the thick, cold-choked fog. She pulled her woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, her mind racing with the implications of the Duke's signature on the shipping manifests. She had to act, but the precise nature of her next move eluded her. As she turned the corner toward her modest flat above the bakery, a shadow detached itself from the brickwork of a narrow alleyway. "A wretched night for a walk, is it not, your grace?" The voice was grating, devoid of the sycophantic warmth Beatrice was accustomed to hearing in Mayfair drawing rooms. She froze, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she did not gasp, and she did not run. The gutters of Spitalfields had taught her that prey only dies faster when it flees. She turned slowly to face the gaunt, sharply dressed man blocking her path. "I believe you are mistaken, sir. My name is Clara Hayes." Arthur Pendleton stepped into the pool of the street lamp, tipping his bowler hat. "You are an excellent actress, Lady Beatrice. I will grant you that. You've shed the Harrington softness quite convincingly, but I have spent 20 years hunting the worst of London's underworld. A smudge of soot and a dropped consonant do not hide the bone structure of a duchess. Nor do they hide the fact that a woman with the education of a mathematical prodigy suddenly appeared in the Customs House 6 months to the day after you vanished from Stirling Manor." Beatrice assessed him. He was not a policeman. His coat was too expensive, his demeanor too mercenary. "Alistair sent you?" "The Duke of Rothbury is a very desperate, very wealthy client," Pendleton replied, his eyes cold. "Or at least, he pretends to be wealthy. He has paid me handsomely to locate his delirious wandering wife and return her to the safety of her gilded bedchamber. I have a closed carriage waiting at the end of the street. You can come quietly, or I can summon 2 very large men to assist you. The choice is entirely yours, Your Grace. Beatrice's mind worked with the terrifying speed of a tumbling combination lock. Alistair was desperate. The manifests proved he was illegally leasing cargo space to generate liquid cash. Pendleton was a man driven by profit, not loyalty. "Mr. Pendleton, is it?" Beatrice asked, her voice dropping the working-class affectation, returning to the razor-sharp, aristocratic, clipped tones of her birthright. Pendleton blinked, slightly taken aback by her sudden shift in posture. "It is. Before you summon your thugs, I suggest you accompany me up to my flat. I have something you need to see, something that will make you realize that delivering me to Alistair Sterling is the most foolish financial decision you could possibly make." Pendleton scoffed. "I do not bargain with bounties, Lady Beatrice." "You bargain with money," she countered fiercely, stepping closer to him, completely unafraid. "The Duke is paying you with my father's money, or rather, the interest of my father's money. But you are a clever man. You must know that by law, he cannot touch the principal of the Harrington Trust without my signature. Why do you think he is so desperate to find me? It isn't love, Mr. Pendleton. It is insolvency." Pendleton hesitated. He had seen the Duke's crumbling estates, the frantic letters from creditors on Alistair's desk. "5 minutes," Beatrice said. "If you are not convinced that I am a far more lucrative ally than your current employer, you may drag me to your carriage." Intrigued despite himself, Pendleton followed her up the narrow, creaking stairs to her flat. The room was sparsely furnished, but immaculately clean. A small coal fire burned in the grate. Beatrice walked straight to a locked wooden trunk at the foot of her bed, produced a key from a chain around her neck, and retrieved a thick stack of copied documents. She had spent the last 3 hours painstakingly copying Reed's contracts. She slapped the papers onto the small dining table. "Look at them." Pendleton pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and leaned over the documents. "These are standard maritime sublet agreements, signed by the Duke." "Look closer," Beatrice commanded. "Look at the vessel names, the HMS Leviathan, the Empress of the Seas, and the Iron Monarch. He is leasing the cargo holds of these ships to Nathaniel Reed and Company for a massive sum, demanding 60% of the payment up front. A standard practice for a man needing quick capital," Pendleton observed, though his brow was furrowed. "It would be if he hadn't already leased those exact same cargo holds to the East India Company 2 months ago," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with ice. "I know this because my father built those ships. I know their tonnage. I know their routes. Alistair is double-booking the fleet. He is taking upfront cash from independent merchants like Reed, knowing full well the ships are already loaded with crown cargo. It is maritime fraud on a catastrophic scale. When the ships sail next month and Reed's cargo is left rotting on the docks, the discrepancy will be reported to Lloyd's of London. There will be an investigation." Pendleton's breath hitched. He was a creature of the law, and he knew exactly what she was describing. "Embezzlement, fraud against the crown. If you take me back to Stirling Manor, Alistair will force me to sign over the principal. He will cover his debts, bury the fraud, and you will receive your final fee," Beatrice stated, pacing the small room. "But I will not sign. I will let him torture me before I give that monster another shilling. The fraud will be exposed. He will go to Newgate Prison. His assets will be seized by the Crown, and you, Mr. Pendleton, will be left with nothing but a scandal." Pendleton slowly removed his glasses. "And what is the alternative, Your Grace?" "The alternative is the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, Beatrice said, a triumphant fire burning in her eyes. "Alistair believes that because we wed, he owns me and my fortune. He is operating under outdated assumptions. My father's lawyers structured the Harrington Trust under the new protections of the Act just before he died. The principal and the controlling shares of the shipping empire belong solely to me. I am the Harrington Trust. Alistair has been illegally acting as a proxy." She stopped pacing and stared directly into Pendleton's eyes. "I am going to destroy him. I'm going to strip him of everything he stole from me, and I'm going to do it legally, publicly, and utterly. I need an agent, someone who knows the dark corners of London, who can handle the banks, the courts, and the press. You work for me now, Mr. Pendleton, and when I reclaim my empire, I will pay you triple whatever the Duke promised you with a retainer for the rest of your natural life." The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the coal fire. Pendleton looked at the torn, hardened, brilliant woman before him. He had come looking for a hysterical runaway bride. He had found a general preparing for war. A slow, terrifying smile spread across the detective's face. "Where shall we begin, Lady Beatrice?" 4 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Sterling Manor was suffocatingly toxic. Alistair Sterling paced the length of his grand study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. The air stank of stale cigar smoke and spilled brandy. His life was collapsing with terrifying speed. Genevieve had vanished a week prior, quietly packing her trunks in the middle of the night and fleeing to Paris with a minor Austrian diplomat, leaving behind nothing but a mocking note detailing Alistair's inadequacies. His creditors, previously held at bay by the promise of the Harrington wealth, had suddenly and aggressively called in their debts. Baring Brothers, the most prestigious bank in London, had frozen his accounts. Arthur Pendleton had completely disappeared, taking Alistair's advance fee and providing no intelligence on Beatrice's whereabouts. Then salvation arrived in the form of a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the wax seal of the Sovereign Syndicate, an anonymous consortium of private wealth investors known for bailing out distressed aristocracy for a steep price. The letter invited the Duke of Rothbury to their private boardroom in the City of London to sign a comprehensive debt restructuring agreement. They would clear his ledgers, provided he signed over temporary voting rights to the Harrington fleet. It was a humiliating defeat, but it was his only escape from debtor's prison. Dressed in his finest tailored suit, though the fabric hung slightly loose on his increasingly gaunt frame, Alistair rode his carriage into the financial heart of the city. He was escorted into an opulent, mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor of a towering stone building overlooking the Thames. 3 men sat at the long table, barristers and bankers in severe black suits, but the large, high-backed leather chair at the head of the table was turned away from him, facing the window. "Duke of Rothbury," one of the bankers said, gesturing to a seat, "we have prepared the documents. As agreed, the syndicate will assume the entirety of your debt, totaling some £400,000, in exchange for full operational control of the Harrington Shipping Trust." Alistair sat down, a sneer of aristocratic arrogance masking his profound relief. "Let us get this over with. The paperwork, please." A heavy silence fell over the room. The large leather chair at the head of the table slowly swiveled around. "Before you sign anything, Alistair," a voice rang out, clear, cold, and echoing with unshakable authority. "We must discuss the terms of your surrender." Alistair's blood turned to ice in his veins. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany. Sitting before him was not the timid, adoring girl who had fled into the fog. Lady Beatrice Harrington sat with a posture of absolute dominance. Her hair was styled immaculately, yet without the excessive, frivolous curls he had once demanded. She wore a tailored suit dress of midnight blue wool, a sharp, almost mocking echo of the velvet gown she had torn apart, adorned with no jewelry save for a simple silver comb. "Beatrice," Alistair choked out, his face draining of all color. What is the meaning of this? Where have you been? You are my wife." "I am the sole proprietor of the Harrington Trust, protected under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, Beatrice corrected smoothly, leaning forward and resting her hands on the table. "And I am the head of the Sovereign Syndicate. You are sitting in my building, Alistair." Alistair sprang to his feet, rage rapidly replacing his shock. "You insolent, deceitful little wretch. You are my property. I will have you dragged back to Oxfordshire in irons. I will have you committed to an asylum." None of the barristers moved. In the corner of the room, a door opened, and Arthur Pendleton stepped out from the shadows, leaning casually against the wall. "Mr. Pendleton?" Alistair stammered, his eyes darting between the detective and his wife. "Arrest her, I command you." "I am afraid I no longer work for you, Your Grace," Pendleton said dryly. "My current employer pays far better, and she is significantly less prone to committing felonies." Beatrice gestured to the stack of documents on the table. "Sit down, Alistair. Unless you prefer, I summon the constabulary right now." Trembling with a mixture of fury and rising terror, the Duke slowly sank back into his chair. Over the past month, Beatrice began, her voice devoid of any emotion, my agents have meticulously audited the accounts you believed you controlled. I have copies of the fraudulent manifests you signed with Nathaniel Reed and 3 other independent merchants. I have sworn affidavits from the dockmasters confirming you double-booked the Leviathan and the Iron Monarch, and I have the letters you wrote to your bookies, using my father's name as collateral. Alistair swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. You cannot prove— I can prove all of it, Beatrice snapped, the sudden volume of her voice making him flinch. I was the one who balanced Nathaniel Reed's ledgers. I saw your pathetic, desperate signatures with my own eyes. I was the ghost in your machine, Alistair. You spent 2 years treating me like a mindless accessory, mocking my intellect, assuming I was too weak to ever understand the world you operated in. That arrogance has just cost you your life. She slid a single, legally bound document across the table. It was not a bailout. This is a deed of separation, citing irreconcilable differences and profound financial misconduct, Beatrice explained, her tone completely clinical. It stipulates that you will formally relinquish any and all legal claims to my person, my estate, and the Harrington Shipping Trust. You will publicly state that our marriage was dissolved due to your own moral failings. In exchange, I will personally cover the debts you owe to the banks, and I will destroy the evidence of your maritime fraud. Alistair stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. You are stripping me of everything. My title will mean nothing. I will be ruined in society, a laughingstock. You ruined yourself in the conservatory the night of the autumn equinox, Beatrice said, her eyes flashing with the memory of the betrayal. You laughed at my devotion. You called me a convenience, a gullible child. Let us see how the great Duke of Rothbury survives without his convenience. I won't sign it, Alistair spat, though his voice lacked conviction. I will fight you in the courts. A man's word against a hysterical woman's. Beatrice stood up. She walked around the table until she was standing directly behind him. She leaned down, her lips inches from his ear. Fight me, she whispered, her voice laced with venom. Please, Alistair, fight me. Take me to court. Let me lay out your debts, your affair with Genevieve Croft, your pathetic begging letters, and your blatant fraud before a judge and the society papers. Let the entire world see that the mighty Duke of Rothbury is nothing but a desperate, thieving parasite who tried to steal a woman's fortune and failed. If you do not sign that paper in the next 10 seconds, Mr. Pendleton will walk out that door and hand the manifest to Scotland Yard. You will be in a cell in Newgate Prison by nightfall. The silence in the room was absolute. Alistair looked at the unmoving barristers. He looked at Pendleton, who merely raised a cynical eyebrow. He was completely, utterly surrounded. The trap had closed, and there was no escape. With a shaking hand, Alistair reached for the pen. The scratch of the nib against the parchment sounded violently loud in the quiet room. He signed his name, effectively signing away his power, his wealth, and his pride. When he finished, Beatrice took the document. She did not smile. She felt no joy, only a profound, hollow sense of finality. You may leave, she said quietly. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. If I see your face in London, I will ruin you. Alistair stood up, a broken, hollowed-out shell of the arrogant aristocrat he had been an hour prior. He didn't look at her as he walked out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors shutting with a resounding, permanent thud behind him. The scandal rocked the foundations of Victorian high society. The abrupt separation of the Duke and Duchess of Rothbury dominated the gossip columns for months. True to the agreement, Alistair released a carefully worded, humiliating statement, accepting full responsibility for the dissolution of the marriage, citing his own imprudent financial misjudgments. Without the Harrington wealth to sustain his lavish lifestyle, the sterling estate was quickly foreclosed upon by the banks Beatrice had paid off. Alistair Sterling, stripped of his pride and his capital, was forced to flee England to avoid the sheer embarrassment of his new reality. He relocated to a decaying, drafty villa in the hills of Florence, living out the rest of his days on a meager allowance provided by a distant cousin a bitter, isolated man haunted by the ghost of the wife he had so casually discarded. Genevieve Croft fared no better. Her Austrian diplomat soon tired of her demanding nature and sharp tongue, abandoning her in Vienna without a penny to her name. The society she once mocked quickly closed its doors to her. But for Lady Beatrice Harrington, the end of her marriage was merely the prologue to her true life. She did not retreat to the countryside to lick her wounds, nor did she re-enter the frivolous, suffocating world of Mayfair balls and society gossip. Instead, she took her rightful place at the helm of the Harrington Shipping Trust. The business world of London was shocked to see a woman step into the ruthless, male-dominated arena of maritime trade. Many expected her to fail within the year, but Beatrice had forged herself in the fires of Spitalfields and the Customs House. She knew the ledgers better than her own accountants. She understood the supply chains, the tariffs, and the ruthless nature of negotiation. She retained Arthur Pendleton as her chief of security and private intelligence, paying him exactly the exorbitant sum she had promised. Together, they rooted out corruption within the fleet, streamlined routes, and outmaneuvered rival monopolies. She also remembered the man who had given Clara Hayes a chance. She purchased Nathaniel Reed's entire importing business at a premium, appointing him as the head of her newly formed Caribbean Logistics Division, ensuring the gruff, honest merchant would never have to worry about his own ledgers again. By the turn of the century, Beatrice Harrington was known as the Iron Duchess of the Thames. She was one of the wealthiest, most formidable independent women in Europe. The Rothschilds sought her counsel on international shipping tariffs. Members of Parliament actively courted her favor to secure safe passage for government goods. She never remarried. She had learned the brutal cost of handing one's heart and autonomy over to the institution of marriage, and she refused to ever share her empire with a man again. Years later, sitting in her palatial office overlooking the bustling London docks, Beatrice stood by the window, watching one of her massive iron-hulled freighters slowly making its way out to sea. The ship was a marvel of modern engineering, a testament to her vision and her relentless drive. On her desk rested a small glass display box. Inside it was a beautifully embroidered, delicate silk handkerchief bearing the initials A.S., a remnant of the girl who had spent hours trying to prove her love to a monster. Beside the handkerchief lay a simple, rusted iron key, the key to the miserable, freezing room in Mrs. Gable's boarding house where Clara Hayes was born. She kept them there as a daily reminder, a reminder that the world will gladly put you in a gilded cage and convince you it is a palace. It will mock your devotion and feed off your weakness. But the moment you realize the door is unlocked, the moment you decide to pack nothing and step out into the fog, that is the moment you stop being a convenience and start becoming a queen. And that, dear listeners, is the incredible, true-to-life saga of Lady Beatrice Harrington, a woman who refused to let a man's mockery dictate her destiny. She walked into the freezing fog with nothing but 30 gold coins and emerged as the Iron Duchess of the Thames, an absolute titan of industry who legally and ruthlessly crushed the very monster who tried to break her. Her story is a timeless reminder that your value is never defined by those who take you for granted, and sometimes the greatest revenge is building an empire entirely your own. If Beatrice's fierce journey from a discarded, heartbroken bride to an unstoppable, independent queen gave you chills, hit that like button to honor her triumph. Share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder of their own worth, and subscribe to our channel for more hidden, jaw-dropping histories of women who rewrote the rules. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next incredible story.